that I taught. And when we sat down and started talking about this, I asked him, so Phil, you've got all these faith communities coming from all parts of the city, from all parts of the world, in fact, I said, could you say in one word or one or two what it is that makes the multi-faith centre really tick, what really holds it together? And he said, yes, it's the food. So I'm aware that I'm up against some rather stiff competition, seeing as we've just had the buffet, but I'll do my best. I've had a great deal of interest and a great deal of fun talking to people who've been involved in the Faith Centre since its beginning and since before its beginning, and also doing a little bit of research online. And I found out things about my own university that I never knew. And I've realised how far the Multi-Faith Centre has come from its earliest beginnings. Because back in the days when, well, before the university was even here, and when there were various colleges here and there about the city, there was a Bishop Lonsdale Teaching College, which was the roots of the Multi-Faith Centre. And they had a prayer room, but the prayer room was used by the music department to store drums. There was a Muslim prayer space which consisted of a shed in the car park. And that was terrible, and the most terrible thing about it was that it was pointing in the wrong direction. And I asked the fellow who told me this story, I asked, well, why didn't they just turn it round and point it in the right direction at the very least? And he said they couldn't, it would have fallen to pieces. And from those little beginnings, back around, getting on for 10 years ago now and a little bit more, they began to realise that Derby University and the colleges which went up to make Derby University have always had a very strong historic commitment to the study and the practice of faith in all its forms. And sometime around 1991 or 1992, they all sit down, and there were many representatives from all the faith communities of the city, Bahais and Buddhists and Christians and Muslims and Jews and Sikhs. They all sat down and they decided that one room full of drums and a small shed in the car park was probably not meeting the commitment to the representation of faith that the university was taking on. And so they sat down and asked what could they do better. And the answer to that question is around you now, and here we all are part of it. And it was very quickly realised that a multi-faith centre would be a wonderful way of expressing the university's commitment to faith in all its forms. But the first thing that they had to do, so I'm told, I wasn't there, but so I'm told by those who were there, was sit down and work out the fine detail. Because a place for all faith and worshipping communities to come together sounds like a wonderful idea in principle, but when you get down to the detail, there's a lot of talking to do. For instance, if you're building a church, then churches historically have tended to point towards one point of the compass. Mosques have tended to point towards another point of the compass. The first practical question that they had to answer was, which direction is the building going to point in? And it's not an easy question to answer. There were lots and lots of little questions like that. The other was, could we ever have alcohol on the premises? Well, there are faith communities in the city who would never think of having alcohol in their own places of worship. There are other faith communities in the city where alcohol, you pretty much need it. And so, all these questions and many more had to be answered, and so when they all sat down to put their heads together and come up with a complicated answer to a simple question, how do we build a multi-faith centre in the city? Well, what I was told, again by the people who were there, is that it's easy to, when you look at the multi-faith centre, I walk past it every day, I come into work, and what I see is this beautiful building. And what I see when I come in here is all these wonderful people together. But what I was told by the people who were there right at the beginning was that the multi-faith centre began before there was ever a brick put in the ground. And it began before there was ever a project funded and raised to put out into the city. It began in the conversations at the very, very beginning, when everybody sat down in hope and in trust to try and work out which direction the building was going to point in and whether you'd ever be able to have alcohol on the premises. That conversation was where the multi-faith centre began. And it was felt very quickly that there was a way in which it could be expressed and a way in which it could be created. And little by little, over the course of those conversations, they came up with a project brief for the multi-faith centre. And when they had an idea of what they wanted, when they had an idea of what would work, and they were very clear that what was not wanted was a little corridor with a lot of rooms off the corridors, with one faith community in one room and one faith community in another room, and one faith community in another room, and so on all the way down the corridor. What was wanted was a place where really and truly everybody could come together and could talk and share the space. And there were all sorts of thoughts and ideas as to the best way that that could be expressed. And when they had all those thoughts down on paper, and when they had the ideal, when they had the dream, when they had the vision, what they then realised was that they'd have to build a great big building to put it all in, and raise some money to build the building. And so a couple of people at this point came forward as people who were going to be taking the steer and leading things forward. And one of them was a fascinating gentleman who I've never met, but I've heard a great deal about over the last few weeks. He was a gentleman by the name of Harold Haywood. And I have to be sure and make it clear that I'm no relation. And the gentleman who told me the story of Harold Haywood said, oh, Harold Haywood was a great and important man in the communities of Britain. And what had happened, if you cast your mind back to the early 60s, down in Brighton and down on the coach towns of England, the young men would go down and they would fight, and there were riots over who was wearing what kind of suit and who was wearing what kind of leather jacket. There were riots and unrest. And in the middle of all these riots, so I'm told, there was one man from the churches who walked straight into the middle of the fight and started talking to all the lads who were involved. And he talked to them all, and more importantly, he listened to them all, and in the end, they were all talking to him. And his name was Harold Haywood, and when he retired, he came over here to take over, to raise the funds to build the multi-faith centre. And I heard that story and I was agog, and the fellow who told me the story said, well, there's more to it than that, he said. We had another fellow who was chairman of the board of the trustees. His name was Jonathan Bailey, and he was the Bishop of Derby. And he too was a very important man in the development, the cultural development and the historical development of the country. And I said, well, I'm not surprised. Would you expect that of somebody who was a Bishop of Derby? And he said, no, it wasn't the fact that he was a Bishop of Derby, it's the fact that he went to school with John Lennon out of the Beatles. And when he was in the sixth form, he gave John Lennon his first ever gig. And you'd think it would be downhill from there on, but it wasn't, because he went on to be Bishop of Derby and chairman of the Board of Trustees at the Multi-Faith Centre. And then, once they had the committee set up and once they were ready to go, they had to have a design for the building, and they had a competition. And there were 4 or 5 firms that they invited to put in for this competition. And pretty much at the last minute, they put in a 6th firm, and they didn't really, it was almost, as I suppose you might say, to make up the numbers. And when the brief arrived on the desk of this Birmingham firm, they looked around, and they looked around the office for somebody who wasn't engaged on anything more important and didn't look like they had very much to do. And they handed the brief over to a young, recently arrived partner in the firm whose name was Mark Swindell. And Mark Swindell, apparently, so I'm told, I'm only going on what I'm told, I'm a professional storyteller, and you have to understand that we lie for a living. But I had this story from people whose veracity is unimpeachable. Mark Swindell took the brief and he thought, oh, I'll give this a go, it's a quiet week, and he designed a multi-faith centre. He designed it to the brief, he came up here and he looked around. He designed a building which didn't point in the right direction or the wrong direction. He designed a building which didn't have a straight line in it. He designed a building that could genuinely and truly be a space where all the faith communities of the city could come together. And he entered this in the competition, and he beat off the competition, and he won the competition. And such was the enthusiasm for his design that they'd accepted it before they'd realised that they couldn't afford to build it. And so the fundraising had to go into action. And I'm told that the fundraising began with an event in which the theme tune from 2001: A Space Odyssey was played. Da, 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 dum, 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 and off they went fundraising. And then they faced another challenge. And the gentleman who told me this story, I won't embarrass him by naming him, but he's here among us tonight. He was a representative of one of the churches, and they sat down and he said, we're going to have to go fundraising. And he says, this is going to be difficult, he says. We've worked out whether we can have wine in the building. We've worked out whether we've got a shape of the building that everybody can share, he says, but this is going to be the biggest challenge of all, he said. And they said, why? He says, I can't go asking people for money. I'm English. We're shy. And they said, no, go out and ask for money. And so he went out and he started asking for money. And he went up and down the length and breadth of the country, all over the world. And he began to raise funds. And I'll tell you a couple of stories of the adventures that he had while he was raising funds. One of the first places that he went was a Sikh Gurdwara. And he had made an arrangement with the worshipping community there that he would go in and they would give him 10 minutes to talk about the raising funds for the multi-faith centre. And very nervously and very tentatively, into the Gurdwara went he, and at the appropriate moment he stood up and he was asked to give his talk, and he began talking. And if he was anything like as nervous as I am sometimes when I do these things, he has all of my sympathies. And as he was in the middle of his talk about the multi-faith centre, somebody got up and started coming towards him, and he thought, good heavens, I'm going to get my face knocked in here. And the gentleman came up, and he put his hand in his pocket, and he took out a paper banknote. And it wasn't a small one either. And he laid it on the ground at his feet. And then another one came, and another, and another, and another. And by the end of the 10-minute talk, he walked out of the Gurdwara with a plastic carrier bag full of over £1,000 of cash. And he took it home. The other story that the same gentleman told me, which I'll share with you very briefly, is that one of the first things he did when he was fundraising is he wrote to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Bahai community of Britain. And he wrote very tentatively asking for an expression of interest in the multi-faith centre that they were planning. And pretty much by return, he got a letter from the National Spiritual Assembly saying that they thought it was a terrific idea, and they pledged themselves there and then at that moment to give £50,000. And the thing is, they had that letter, it was signed, sealed and delivered in the chaplaincy, and then the National Spiritual Community of the Bahais wrote to all the 5,000 or 6,000 Bahais who worship in Britain and said, we've promised to give the multi-faith centre at Derby University £50,000. Unless you give us the money, you'll make liars of us, and that would be wrong. And by those means, the Bahais community gave £50,000. And so the money started to flow in. Little by little, the money started to flow in. But sadly, it became very clear that it probably wasn't going to be enough. And so Mark Swindell's great, wonderful design had to be adapted. It was just as wonderful in terms of its scope and its vision, but the building had to be a little bit smaller than they thought. But still, it wasn't going to be enough. And just at that point, the committee, the fundraising committee, was sitting around and thinking, we might just have to apply for lottery funding. What would be wrong with applying for lottery funding? Well, there are faith communities in the city who don't accept that it's all right to take money from gambling. And so they had to sit down and work out, if you're taking money from the lottery, does that mean that it's the profits of gambling? There was a whole other discussion about that, similar to the one about the wine in the building, similar to the one about the orientation to the points of the compass. And in the end, just when they were beginning to realise that there might be a way forward, and all this money that was being put out there to do good in the world, some of it might come here and do good here, as well you think it might. At that point, the Millennium Commission got in touch with Derby University and said, we've got some money going spare, would you like it? To which the response was, of course, yes. And there's a rumour going around, as I say, I work as a professional storyteller, I lie for a living, so you don't want to take my word for it, but there's a rumour going around that that money became available because it was in 2003, which was 3 years after the Millennium. The Millennium Commission had practically run out of money, they just had a little bit left, and they'd committed it to another building project, and then they were going to pack up and go home, when suddenly the building that they'd committed the last bit of funds to fell down and couldn't be funded anymore, and so they were looking around for somewhere to fund it, so it came here. And it came here, and it was decided that they were going to accept it. Once it was accepted, they had enough money to begin. And when all these debates and discussions were done, and when all these practicalities were sorted, it was, so I'm told, coming on to about tea time on the 6th of October 2003. And just as they were beginning to pack things up and go home, secure in the knowledge that they had at last money to begin building at last the multi-faith centre which surrounds us now, somebody around the table looked at the small print and said, what's the date? And somebody else said it's the 6th of October. He says the 6th of October 2003. He said, do you realise that it's a condition of funding that work must have begun by the 6th of October 2003? And so, with lightning reflexes and indomitable will, there and then they grabbed a trowel and dug a hole in the ground. And as I say, I lie for a living, but if you don't trust me, go and look. The photograph of the moment is there in the room where we've just been having. Eileen Fry, who had just been appointed director of the multi-faith centre that was yet to be built, is pictured in the photograph with a trowel in her hands, digging desperately against the clock in order to qualify for the Millennium Commission funding that was eventually obtained. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty much how the building which we see around us came to be erected. And I could tell you all, I won't, I could talk all night about the things that Phil and Jonathan and many other people as well have been telling me about the work that's gone on. One of the first things that happened in the early days is that it genuinely did become a home in the sense of a place of worship, a facility for worshipping communities, many of whom had been in the city for a very long time, but many of whom had not been in the city for very long at all, and who needed a place in which they could express their communal faith and their life together. That's one of the things that the Multi-Faith Centre did in the early days. Little by little, as time went by and premises were found elsewhere in the city, it's been necessary for the Multi-Faith Centre not to wait for the city to come here, but to go out to the city, and that's exactly what they've been doing. There's a series of debates that go on here every Wednesday. They're called the Get Real Philosophical Debates. No question is unanswered and no answer goes unquestioned. The ideal is free and fearless debate. Everybody can say what they think. And I've been told that sometimes passions have run so high and debate has become so heated that people have occasionally had to walk out and go. But what I've been told, and again I'm going on what I've been told, is that people may walk out from time to time, but they always come back. And out in the city, the adventures that the staff of the Multi-Faith Centre have had, there was a park in the city where it was becoming unsafe to go. And so they went in by evening, by night, with families from all the different communities of the city. They flooded that park with lights. They got all the children to build a bridge from one length of the park to the other. And they reclaimed the park for the families of the neighbourhood who belonged it. There have been occasions when bands have been busking for hours on end in the market square, clarinet bands, with rain pouring down. And, you know, the rain pouring down would have been bad enough in itself, but not only was the rain pouring down, for a performance space, they happened to have selected that bit under the fountain in the assembly room. So the rain was the least of their problems in terms of the water. But they kept on playing and they kept on raising money. And there's been an occasion, the wonderful people who've passed through the doors of the Multi-Faith Centre and graced it with their presence and left their legacy. Just to quote one example before I finish, there was a very senior figure from one of the faith communities represented here who was invited to give a talk, and the title of the talk that they were going to give was The One True Religion. And they arrived. And they came in and there was chairs sat round and people filed in. And the speaker on that occasion sat down and started calling people to come and sit down. And he wouldn't begin his talk until the people who were sat closest to him were the representatives of the faith that was not his own. And when that was done, he looked round and he said, "You've asked me here tonight to talk about the one true religion. I'm not going to talk about the one true religion. I'm going to talk about truth in religion." And that's exactly what he did. And when I'd heard all of these stories, and when I'd listened to so many people who have been working in this building so close to where I myself work for so long, and I've known so little about it, I was tempted, as storytellers sometimes are, to start asking the slightly awkward questions. And I said to Phil, Phil, all this is very wonderful, I said, but have you ever encountered any opposition in the last 10 years? And he said, "Oh yes, we have," he says. "If you can call it opposition," he says, "we got a fatwa from Saudi Arabia once." And I said, "What was that about?" He says, "Well, we had some Saudi students over, and a fatwa came from their own teacher back in Saudi Arabia, and what it demanded, or what it expected that we do, was explain what a multi-faith centre is and why and how it's an appropriate place for proper Islamic Muslim worship." And we took that and we went through all the questions, and one by one we began to answer them. And we found ourselves talking about why the building is deliberately designed so that it points in all directions at one. We found ourselves explaining why and how and when and under what specific circumstances it is or isn't appropriate to bring wine into the building. We found ourselves explaining why it was that we felt driven to go out the length and breadth of the country and beyond, to go into gurdwaras and temples, to go to the great and the obscure, to go collecting money. We found ourselves explaining why it was that we felt that it was the right thing to do to take money from the millennium and the lottery. We found ourselves explaining all these things, and we put all these answers in a formal reply, and we sent them off back to Saudi Arabia. And we waited, and the answer came back. And the answer was that we had satisfied all the requirements of the fatwa, and that this was an entirely appropriate and suitable place for proper Muslim worship. All of those things. Now, I think that's a long way and a wonderful and exciting journey from a shed in a car park in Bishop Lonsdale College, which you can't even turn to face the right direction in case it falls down. It's a wonderful journey from a room that's just used as a storage place for musical instruments. And as we look forward, the older I get, I don't think I get wiser, but I do think I maybe get a little bit less stupid. And one of the things that really excites me and really excites my admiration, my awe, is these places where people can come together and dialogue, where people can say what they mean in the knowledge that they'll get a hearing, where people can speak freely and fearlessly and be who they are and keep those dialogues going. Places like this shine like stars in the darkening night. And that's why it's been my great privilege and a wonderful and a humbling experience to come here and say happy birthday to the Multi-Faith Centre. Shalom, salam alaikum, namaste, peace be with you. Thank you.